Your Honor, with all due respect, that young man deserves the same consideration you'd give anyone else standing in this courtroom. The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and in that moment, I knew my entire legal career was about to change forever. The gavel came down like thunder, the judge's face turned crimson with rage, and I felt the weight of every eye in that courtroom burning into my back. But I also felt something else, the weight of truth, heavy and uncompromising, settling into my bones like armor. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Maya Richardson, and 6 months ago I was living what I thought was the American dream. At 34, I had worked my way up from a small-town girl in Selma, Alabama, to a respected public defender in downtown Chicago. My corner office on the 23rd floor of the Morrison & Associates building overlooked Grant Park, and on clear days, I could see all the way to Lake Michigan. My law degree from Northwestern hung proudly on the wall next to my bar admission certificate, flanked by photos of me with various judges, politicians, and legal luminaries I'd met throughout my career. I specialized in criminal defense, particularly representing young men and women from underserved communities who reminded me of my younger brother Marcus. Growing up in Alabama in the 90s, I watched him struggle with a system that seemed designed to work against him from the moment he was born. When he was 15, Marcus was arrested for allegedly stealing a bicycle that turned out to belong to his friend, who had lent it to him for the afternoon. The charges were eventually dropped, but not before my baby brother spent 3 nights in juvenile detention and learned to look at police officers with fear instead of trust. I promised myself that day, sitting in that sterile juvenile court waiting room while my mother cried quietly into her hands, that I'd spend my career fighting for people like Marcus. People who deserved better from a system that was supposed to protect them. My daily routine was predictable and comforting in its structure. I'd wake up at 5:30 a.m. in my Lincoln Park apartment, a one-bedroom with exposed brick walls and hardwood floors that I'd saved 3 years to afford. The first thing I'd do was check my phone for any overnight messages from clients or their families. Being a public defender meant being on call for people whose lives could change in an instant. By 6 a.m., I was brewing coffee in the French press my mentor Judge Patricia Williams had given me when I passed the bar exam 8 years earlier. Judge Williams was the first black woman to serve on the Cook County Circuit Court, and she'd taken me under her wing during my 3rd year of law school when I interned in her chambers. Maya, she told me on my last day as her intern, the law isn't just about knowing the rules. It's about knowing when to break them for the right reasons. While my coffee steeped, I'd review case files at my small dining table, making notes in the margins and highlighting key precedents. My apartment was filled with legal books, case studies, and trial transcripts. My ex-boyfriend Derek used to joke that dating me was like dating the law library. Derek was a marketing executive who couldn't understand why I'd chosen to represent criminals, instead of pursuing corporate law where I could make real money. That relationship ended when he suggested I was wasting my potential by caring more about justice than my bank account. By 7 a.m., I was dressed in one of my carefully chosen power suits, navy blue, charcoal gray, or deep burgundy. I'd learned early in my career that appearance mattered in courtrooms, especially for a young black woman. I needed to look authoritative without appearing threatening, professional without seeming cold, confident without coming across as arrogant. It was a delicate balance that my white male colleagues never had to consider. The commute to my office took 25 minutes on the Red Line, and I used that time to mentally prepare for the day ahead. I'd review my court schedule, think through my arguments, and center myself for whatever challenges awaited. Some mornings, I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in the train window and feel a surge of pride. Here I was, a girl from Selma, Alabama, whose grandmother had cleaned houses for white families, riding the train to my law office in downtown Chicago. I was living proof that the American dream was real, that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Morrison & Associates had recruited me straight out of law school. They needed diversity and I needed a chance. It wasn't lost on me that I was one of only 3 black attorneys in a firm of 47 lawyers, but I told myself that representation mattered. Every time a young black defendant saw me standing at the defense table, it sent a message. You belong here, your voice matters, justice isn't just for some people. The firm occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise. The reception area was all marble and mahogany, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. My office was smaller than those of the senior partners, but it had a window and enough space for my law books, case files, and the small collection of African violets I'd inherited from my grandmother. I had built a reputation for being thorough, passionate, and unafraid to challenge the system when it failed my clients. My success rate was impressive, 73% of my cases resulted in reduced charges or acquittals. I believed in the law, in justice, in the idea that if you worked hard enough, prepared thoroughly enough, and spoke eloquently enough, you could make a difference. My typical caseload included everything from drug possession charges to domestic violence cases, from petty theft to aggravated assault. Each client had a story, a life that extended far beyond the charges they faced. There was Maria Gonzalez, a single mother of 3 who was caught shoplifting baby formula because she couldn't afford groceries after her hours were cut at the hotel where she worked as a housekeeper. There was Deshaun Thompson, a 17-year-old honor roll student who made the mistake of being in the wrong place when his cousin decided to rob a convenience store. There was Sarah Mitchell, a 62-year-old grandmother arrested for possession of marijuana she used to manage chronic pain because she couldn't afford prescription medication. These weren't faceless criminals. They were human beings caught in circumstances that could have happened to anyone. They were people who deserved compassion, understanding, and zealous advocacy. They were people who reminded me why I'd become a lawyer in the first place. My colleagues at Morrison & Associates respected my work, even if they didn't always understand my passion for criminal defense. Senior partner Robert Morrison often praised my dedication to pro bono work, though criminal defense was actually my full-time job, not charity work. Partner Sarah Chin would sometimes ask me how I could defend those people, as if my clients were somehow less deserving of legal representation than the corporate executives and insurance companies the firm typically represented. But I loved what I did. I loved the challenge of building a defense strategy, the satisfaction of negotiating a fair plea agreement, the thrill of arguing before a jury. I loved the moment when a client realized that someone was fighting for them, that they weren't alone in the system. I loved being the voice for people who had been silenced, ignored, or written off by society. That belief in the power of the law, in the possibility of justice, was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. The weather was typical for Chicago in early spring, gray, cold, and unpredictable. I'd arrived at the courthouse by 8:30 a.m. for a 9 a.m. hearing, giving myself time to meet with my client and review the case one final time. The case seemed routine enough. 22-year-old Jerome Washington, charged with possession of marijuana with intent to distribute. The police had found 2 ounces of marijuana in his backpack during a traffic stop, just barely over the threshold that distinguished simple possession from intent to distribute. The evidence was circumstantial at best, and I was confident we could get the charges reduced to simple possession with community service and maybe a small fine. Jerome was waiting for me in the small attorney conference room adjacent to the courthouse lockup. He was a tall, lanky young man with kind eyes and a nervous habit of adjusting his glasses when he was anxious. This was his first time in the criminal justice system, and his fear was palpable. "Ms. Richardson," he said, standing up when I entered the room. His mother had raised him to be polite, and it showed in every interaction we'd had. "Thank you for being here. I've been up all night thinking about this." "Jerome, we've been over this," I said, setting my briefcase on the small metal table. "The evidence is weak. The search was questionable. And you have no prior record. I'm confident we can work something out that won't derail your future." Jerome was a junior at Chicago State University, majoring in computer science with a 3.7 GPA. He worked part-time at a local electronics store and was trying to support his younger sister Keisha after their mother passed away from cancer the previous year. He'd been the man of the house since he was 19, handling everything from rent payments to grocery shopping while maintaining his grades and his job. The marijuana, he insisted, was for personal use, a way to manage the anxiety and depression that had consumed him since his mother's death. He'd bought more than usual because his dealer had offered a bulk discount, and he figured it would last him several months. It was a mistake, he admitted, but not the actions of someone trying to build a drug empire. "I keep thinking about what my mama would say if she could see me now," Jerome said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She worked so hard to keep me and Keisha out of trouble. She cleaned office buildings at night so we could live in a better neighborhood, go to better schools. And now look where I am." "Jerome, listen to me," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Your mother would be proud of the man you've become. One mistake doesn't erase everything you've accomplished. We're going to get through this, and you're going to go back to school and finish your degree and take care of your sister just like you planned." We spent 20 minutes reviewing the facts of the case and discussing our strategy. I explained the plea negotiation process, the likelihood of various outcomes, and what he could expect in the courtroom. By the time we finished, Jerome seemed calmer, more hopeful about his future. The presiding judge was the Honorable William Bradshaw, a man I'd appeared before dozens of times over the past 8 years. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair and a commanding presence that demanded respect from everyone in his courtroom. He'd been appointed to the bench 15 years earlier after a distinguished career as a prosecutor, and he was known for being tough but fair. Or so I thought. Judge Bradshaw's courtroom was typical of Cook County: wood paneling, high ceilings, and an American flag hanging behind the bench. The gallery was filled with the usual mix of defendants, family members, attorneys, and court personnel. It was a Tuesday morning, which meant the docket was heavy with arraignments, plea hearings, and other routine matters. As Jerome and I took our seats at the defense table, I noticed something different in Judge Bradshaw's demeanor. His usual professional composure seemed strained, and there was a tension in his shoulders that I'd never observed before. He was reviewing case files with more intensity than usual, making sharp notes in the margins and occasionally shaking his head in what appeared to be disapproval. The morning proceeded routinely through the first several cases. A DUI plea was accepted, a domestic violence case was continued for trial, a petty theft charge was dismissed on prosecutorial motion. Judge Bradshaw was his usual self, firm but professional, asking appropriate questions and ensuring that defendants understood their rights. Then Jerome's name was called. People versus Jerome Washington, the clerk announced. Case number 2024 CR 0847392. Jerome and I stood and approached the defense table. As we did, I noticed Assistant State's Attorney Michael Foster approaching the prosecution table. Foster was a career prosecutor in his 40s who I'd worked with many times before. He was thorough but reasonable, the kind of prosecutor who cared more about justice than conviction rates. Your Honor, Foster began, this is a possession with intent to distribute a case. The defendant was found with 2 ounces of marijuana during a traffic stop. The state is prepared to proceed. Judge Bradshaw looked up from his papers, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach clench. It was the look my grandmother used to get when she talked about the white family she worked for, a mixture of disdain, disgust, and barely concealed hostility. Jerome Washington, Judge Bradshaw said, his voice already carrying a tone of condemnation. 22 years old. Let me guess, another young thug who thinks he can poison our communities and walk away with a slap on the wrist. The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. I felt Jerome stiffen beside me, and I could hear an audible gasp from the gallery. This wasn't how judges spoke in court. This wasn't professional. This wasn't justice. I stood immediately, my training and instincts taking over despite the shock. Your Honor, my client is a college student with no prior record. He's a junior at Chicago State University with a 3.7 GPA, and he works part-time to support his younger sister. The evidence in this case. Ms. Richardson, Judge Bradshaw cut me off with a wave of his hand. Spare me the sob story. I've heard it all before. These people always have some excuse: dead mother, tough neighborhood, trying to support family. Poor grades, family problems, peer pressure. The fact remains that your client was caught with enough marijuana to supply half of Chicago State University. The phrase "these people" hung in the air like poison gas. I felt the breath leave my lungs as I processed what I'd just heard. In my peripheral vision, I could see Jerome's shoulders slump, the hope and confidence we'd built during our morning meeting draining from his face like water from a broken dam. Your Honor, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady despite the rage building inside me like a wildfire, the amount found was barely above the threshold for intent to distribute, and the circumstances strongly suggest personal use. My client deserves the same consideration that any defendant would receive. Consideration. Judge Bradshaw laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Ms. Richardson, I've been on this bench for 15 years, and I've seen hundreds of young men just like Mr. Washington. They come from broken homes, they have no respect for authority, and they see drug dealing as an easy way to make money instead of getting an education or finding honest work. The best thing we can do for society is to send a clear message that this behavior won't be tolerated. I felt my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the defense table. The wood was smooth and cool under my palms, worn down by countless other lawyers who had stood where I was standing, fighting for their clients' lives and futures. Every instinct told me to remain professional, to find another angle, to work within the system. This was how things worked. You stayed calm, you followed protocol, you found a way to advocate for your client without rocking the boat. But watching Jerome's face crumble as the judge spoke about him like he was less than human, like he was a stereotype instead of a person, I couldn't stay silent. I thought about my brother Marcus, about my grandmother cleaning houses for families who saw her as invisible, about every young black man who had stood before a judge and been judged not for his actions but for his skin color. Your Honor, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. My client is not a stereotype. He's a human being with a name, a family, dreams, and aspirations. He's a student who has worked hard to build a future for himself and his sister. He deserves to be judged on the facts of this case, not on your assumptions about young black men. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers paused over her keyboard. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning system and the distant noise of traffic from the street below. I had just accused a sitting judge of racial bias in open court, and everyone in that room knew that my career had just taken a turn from which it might never recover. Judge Bradshaw's face turned deep red, the color spreading from his neck up to his hairline. His eyes narrowed, and when he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Excuse me, counselor? What did you just say?" I could feel Jerome beside me, could sense his fear and confusion. I could see Foster at the prosecution table, his mouth slightly open in shock. I could feel the eyes of every person in the gallery burning into my back. But I also felt something else. The presence of my grandmother, my mentor Judge Williams, my brother Marcus, and every person who had ever been judged not for who they were but for what they looked like. I said my client deserves to be judged as an individual human being, not as a member of a group you've apparently already convicted in your mind based on nothing more than the color of his skin. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then Judge Bradshaw's gavel came down hard, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet courtroom. "Ms. Richardson, you are completely out of line. I will not tolerate accusations of bias in my courtroom. You are in contempt of court. And I won't tolerate my client being treated as less than human because of the color of his skin," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Your Honor, with all due respect, that young man deserves the same consideration you'd give anyone else standing in this courtroom." The aftermath was swift and brutal, like a natural disaster that changes the landscape in minutes. Judge Bradshaw held me in contempt of court, ordering me to pay a $500 fine and spend a night in Cook County Jail. Jerome's case was continued to the following week to be heard by a different judge, but the damage to both our reputations was already spreading through the courthouse like wildfire. As the bailiff approached to escort me out, I turned to Jerome. His eyes were wide with shock and something that looked like awe. "Ms. Richardson, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," I said quietly. "I absolutely did. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't deserve justice, Jerome. Promise me that." He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I promise. And Ms. Richardson? Thank you. No one's ever stood up for me like that before." The walk to the holding cell felt like a funeral procession. Other lawyers in the hallway stopped their conversations to stare. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared shocked, and a few seemed almost angry, as if my actions had somehow threatened their own carefully maintained relationships with the bench. Cook County Jail was exactly as grim as I'd expected: fluorescent lights, concrete walls, and the constant smell of disinfectant mixed with despair. I was processed like any other defendant, fingerprinted, photographed, and issued a standard orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too large. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now experiencing the system from the other side, seeing what my clients went through when they couldn't make bail. My cellmate was a woman named Diane who'd been arrested for writing bad checks to buy groceries for her 3 children. She was 42 years old, worked 2 part-time jobs, and had been trying to stretch her paycheck until the first of the month when she'd get paid again. "You're that lawyer, aren't you?" Diane asked after we'd been talking for a few hours. "The one who told off that judge?" Word traveled fast, even in jail. "I'm a lawyer, yes. And I stood up for my client when a judge treated him unfairly." "Good for you," Diane said with a sad smile. "Most of the lawyers I've met just want to get through their cases as quickly as possible. They don't see us as real people." That night, lying on a thin mattress in a cell that was barely larger than my apartment's walk-in closet, I had plenty of time to think about what I'd done and what it would cost me. I thought about my career, my reputation, my financial security. I thought about my parents who had sacrificed so much to put me through law school. I thought about my colleagues at Morrison and Associates, who had invested time and resources in my professional development. But mostly I thought about Jerome Washington and the look of hope that had died in his eyes when Judge Bradshaw spoke about him like he was less than human. By the time I was released the next morning, my phone had 17 missed calls from the senior partners at Morrison and Associates. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., barely giving me time to go home, shower, and change into fresh clothes. The walk from the jail to the parking garage where I'd left my car felt surreal. It was a beautiful March morning with clear skies and the first hint of spring warming the air. People were going about their normal routines, commuting to work, walking their dogs, grabbing coffee from street vendors. The world had continued spinning while I spent the night in jail, and somehow that felt both comforting and deeply unsettling. My apartment had never looked so welcoming. I stood in my shower for 20 minutes, letting the hot water wash away the smell of jail and the weight of the previous day. When I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, I was surprised to see that I looked the same. Somehow, I'd expected the experience to have changed me physically, but I was still the same woman who had left for court the morning before. The ride to Morrison and Associates felt like traveling to my own execution. The Red Line was crowded with morning commuters, and I found myself wondering how many of them had spent the night in jail, how many had stood up for something they believed in only to face consequences they weren't sure they could handle. The law firm's reception area, which had always felt impressive and welcoming, now seemed cold and intimidating. The receptionist, Janet, who had always greeted me with warmth, barely made eye contact when I told her I was there for the emergency meeting. "They're waiting for you in Conference Room A," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Conference Room A was the largest meeting space in the firm, typically reserved for major client presentations and annual partner meetings. The fact that they'd chosen this room for our discussion felt ominous, like they wanted plenty of space to dress me down properly. Walking into that conference room felt like entering a funeral parlor. The 5 senior partners sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces grave and expressions carefully neutral. Managing partner Robert Morrison sat at the head of the table, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by something cold and professional. Partner Sarah Chin, who had been my mentor when I first joined the firm, couldn't even look at me directly. Partners David Walsh, Jennifer Stevens, and Michael Torres sat with their hands folded, looking like a panel of judges preparing to deliver a verdict. Morrison didn't even look up from his notes when I entered. The morning newspapers were spread across the table: the Chicago Tribune, the Sun-Times, and several legal publications. I could see headlines like "Public Defender Accuses Judge of Racism" and "Courtroom Confrontation Rocks Cook County." "Maya, sit down," Morrison said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "We need to discuss yesterday's incident." I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, feeling like I was facing a firing squad. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. These people had been my colleagues, my mentors, my professional family for 8 years. Now they looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into their building by mistake. "If you're referring to my defense of Jerome Washington's constitutional rights and human dignity, then yes, let's discuss it," I said, trying to project more confidence than I felt. Partner Sarah Chin shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes still avoiding mine. "Maya, you accused a sitting judge of racial bias in open court. You were held in contempt. You spent the night in jail. This is a public relations nightmare for the firm." "A public relations nightmare?" I couldn't hide the disbelief in my voice. "Sarah, did you read the transcript? Did you see how Judge Bradshaw spoke about my client? Did you hear him refer to Jerome as a thug before hearing a single piece of evidence?" "What I saw," Morrison interjected, his voice growing harder, "was a respected member of our firm allowing her emotions to override her professional judgment. Maya, we've invested a lot in your career here. You're bright, talented, and you have what could be a very bright future ahead of you. But you can't let your personal feelings cloud your legal judgment." The phrase "personal feelings" stung more than any gavel could have. Personal feelings. As if believing that all clients deserve equal treatment under the law was some kind of emotional weakness rather than the foundation of the entire justice system. "Personal feelings?" I said, my voice rising slightly. "You mean my belief that all clients deserve equal treatment under the law? You mean my commitment to the constitutional principle that every defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty? You mean my conviction that a judge shouldn't prejudge a case based on the defendant's race?" Partner David Walsh leaned forward, his expression patronizing in a way that made my skin crawl. "Maya, we understand your passion for social justice. It's one of the reasons we hired you. Your commitment to representing underserved communities has been an asset to this firm. But there are ways to advocate for your clients without alienating the very judges who will decide their fates. Ways like staying quiet when they're dehumanized? Ways like pretending not to hear when a judge calls a college student a thug before reviewing any evidence. Ways like being strategic," Morrison said firmly. "Judge Bradshaw has been on the bench for 15 years. He's well respected in the legal community. He sits on the board of the Chicago Bar Association. Your accusations could be seen as defamatory, and they certainly won't help your future clients who appear before him." I felt something cold and hard settle in my stomach. "Are you asking me to apologize?" The silence that followed answered my question more clearly than words ever could. "Maya," Sarah said gently, and I could hear the genuine affection in her voice despite everything, "we think it would be best if you took some time off. Let this situation blow over. Maybe attend some professional development courses on courtroom decorum and advocacy strategies. Take a month or two to let things cool down, and then we can discuss your future with the firm." Professional development? I stood up, my chair scraping against the polished floor. "I have a law degree from Northwestern University. I passed the Illinois bar exam on my first try. I have a 73% success rate with my cases. I've won awards for my advocacy work. What exactly do I need to learn about professional conduct?" "You need to learn when to pick your battles," Morrison said coldly. "And yesterday you picked the wrong one." I looked around the table at these people I had considered mentors, colleagues, friends. Their faces were closed off, defensive, already moving past me to their next problem. They had already made their decision before I walked into the room. "I see," I said quietly. "And what about Jerome Washington? What about my other clients who are scheduled for hearings this week? What about the people who are counting on me to fight for them?" "We'll reassign your cases," Walsh said dismissively. "Don't worry about your clients. They'll be taken care of." Taken care of? By whom? By lawyers who would smile politely while judges made racist comments? By attorneys who valued their reputations more than their clients' dignity? By advocates who had learned to pick their battles so carefully that they never actually fought any of them? "I need some time to think about this," I said, gathering my purse and briefcase. "Maya," Morrison called as I reached the door. "We hope you'll make the right decision. For everyone involved. The right decision." As if there was only one choice that reasonable people could make. As if speaking up for justice was somehow the wrong choice, and staying silent in the face of injustice was the right one. I walked out of that conference room knowing that my career at Morrison & Associates was over, whether I resigned or was fired. The only question was whether I would leave with my dignity intact or allow them to force me into an apology I didn't believe in. I spent the next 3 days in my apartment, alternating between rage, despair, and a strange sense of liberation. The legal blogs were having a field day with the story. The headlines were predictably sensational: defense attorney's courtroom meltdown, public defender accuses judge of racism, Morrison & Associates under fire after attorney's outburst. Most of the coverage painted me as an overzealous young lawyer who had let her emotions get the better of her. The few articles that mentioned the context of my statement glossed over Judge Bradshaw's actual words, instead focusing on the inappropriate nature of my accusations and the proper channels I should have used to address my concerns. The comment sections were brutal. Anonymous users hiding behind screen names called me everything from race baiting, to unprofessional, to much worse. Some suggested I should be disbarred, others questioned whether I was mentally stable. A few defended my actions, but they were drowned out by the chorus of criticism. On Thursday evening, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine and a stack of case files I was supposed to hand over to my replacement, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. "Ms. Richardson? This is Marcus Thompson from the Chicago Tribune. I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak with me about what happened in Judge Bradshaw's courtroom on Tuesday." My first instinct was to hang up. The last thing I needed was more media attention, especially from a reporter who was probably looking for a sensational story about the angry black lawyer who couldn't control herself in court. But something in Marcus Thompson's voice made me pause. He sounded genuine, careful, like someone who understood the weight of what he was asking. "What kind of article are you writing, Mr. Thompson?" "Well, that depends on what you have to say. But I've been covering the courts for 8 years, Ms. Richardson, and I've heard rumors about Judge Bradshaw before. Tuesday's incident might be the first time someone with credentials and standing has been willing to speak up publicly." Rumors. I felt my heart start to race. What kind of rumors? The kind that suggest Tuesday wasn't an isolated incident. The kind that indicate Judge Bradshaw has a pattern of treating defendants differently based on race. But rumors aren't enough for a story like this, Ms. Richardson. I need someone on the record. I need someone willing to tell the truth even if it costs them. I closed my eyes, thinking about Jerome Washington, about all the young men and women who had stood before Judge Bradshaw's bench over the past 15 years, about the lawyers who had stayed silent to protect their careers while their clients were dehumanized. "Mr. Thompson, if I speak to you, what happens to my career?" "I can't answer that, ma'am. But I can tell you that staying silent hasn't been working out too well for justice in Cook County." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Marcus Thompson back and agreed to meet him the next morning. But first, I did something that felt even more terrifying. I called my mentor, Judge Patricia Williams, the woman who had guided me through law school in the early years of my career. Judge Williams had always been a straight shooter, someone who would tell me the truth even when it hurt. If anyone could help me figure out whether I was losing my mind or if what I had witnessed was as serious as I believed it to be, it was her. "Maya, honey," Judge Williams said when I finished recounting the entire story, "I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. I've been waiting for someone like you to speak up about William Bradshaw for years." My breath caught in my throat. "You've known?" "Suspected. But suspecting and proving are different things, as you well know. And Maya, what you did Tuesday, calling out his bias in real time on the record in front of witnesses, that was the bravest thing I've seen a lawyer do in 20 years on the bench. But everyone is saying I was out of line. That I should have handled it differently. That I've destroyed my career for nothing. Everyone is saying that because they're scared, honey. They're scared of rocking the boat, scared of making waves, scared of being next. But Maya, someone has to be first. Someone has to be willing to lose everything to make sure justice means something." Judge Williams paused and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "I'm going to tell you something else, something I probably should have told you years ago. I've had 3 different public defenders come to me privately over the past 5 years with concerns about Judge Bradshaw's treatment of minority defendants. All 3 were afraid to speak up officially because they were worried about retaliation. 3 different lawyers? 3 that I know of. There could be more. Maya, the legal community in this city is smaller than people think and word gets around. There have been whispers about Bradshaw for years, but whispers don't change anything. What you did Tuesday, that was the first time someone with standing said out loud what everyone has been thinking privately. When I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days: clarity. Not certainty about what would happen next, but clarity about what I needed to do. The next morning, I met Marcus Thompson at a coffee shop in Wicker Park, far from the courthouse and the downtown legal district. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a careful way of asking questions that put me at ease. "Before we start," he said, pulling out a small digital recorder, "I want you to know that I've already spoken to 3 other public defenders who have appeared before Judge Bradshaw. They're willing to speak in the background about incidents they've witnessed. You wouldn't be alone in this." For the next 2.5 hours I told him everything. Not just about Tuesday but about the subtle biases I'd noticed over the years, the pattern of harsher sentences for defendants of color, the dismissive way Judge Bradshaw interacted with lawyers who looked like me, the double standard that seemed to apply when young black men appeared in his courtroom. Thompson was a careful interviewer, asking follow-up questions that helped me articulate things I'd felt but hadn't fully processed. He asked for specific examples, dates when possible, and context that would help readers understand the broader implications of what I'd witnessed. "Ms. Richardson," Thompson said as we finished, "I have to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? The story is going to be big. There will be investigations, hearings, possibly ethics complaints. Your life is about to become very public and not everyone is going to see you as a hero." I thought about Jerome Washington, about my brother Marcus, about all the young people who deserve better from the justice system. I thought about my grandmother who had cleaned houses for families who barely saw her as human, and about Judge Patricia Williams who had broken barriers so that women like me could have careers in the law. "Mr. Thompson, I became a lawyer to fight for justice. If I stay silent now, what does that say about everything I've claimed to believe?" The article ran the following Sunday on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, "Pattern of Bias, Cook County Judge Accused of Racial Discrimination by Multiple Sources." My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. and didn't stop for 3 days. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough, like a dam bursting after years of pressure had built up behind it. The Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board launched a formal complaint against Judge Bradshaw within a week of the Tribune article. The Illinois Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission opened an investigation into whether any lawyers had failed to report judicial misconduct. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office announced a review of all sentences handed down by Judge Bradshaw over the past 5 years. Other lawyers began coming forward with their own stories of bias and inappropriate conduct. Assistant Public Defender Maria Santos revealed that Judge Bradshaw had once told her that her client belonged in Mexico, not in my courtroom. Criminal defense attorney David Kim shared an incident where the judge had asked his Korean-American client if he spoke English, despite the fact that the young man had been born in Chicago and was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. Court transcripts were subpoenaed and analyzed by statisticians who found a clear pattern of disparate sentencing. Black defendants appearing before Judge Bradshaw received sentences that were, on average, 37% longer than those given to white defendants charged with similar crimes. The disparity was even more pronounced for young black men between the ages of 18 and 25. The legal community was divided in its response. Some praised my courage in speaking up, while others criticized what they saw as an inappropriate attack on judicial independence. The Chicago Bar Association called for a full investigation while also issuing a statement about the importance of maintaining proper courtroom decorum. Jerome Washington's case was dismissed entirely when the new presiding judge, the Honorable Lisa Martinez, found that the evidence had been obtained through an illegal search. The traffic stop that led to Jerome's arrest had been conducted without reasonable suspicion, making any evidence discovered inadmissible. Jerome was free to continue his studies without the cloud of criminal charges hanging over his future. I attended his graduation from Chicago State University that spring. He walked across the stage in his cap and gown to receive his degree in computer science, and when his name was called, his sister Keisha cheered so loudly that the entire auditorium turned to look. After the ceremony, Jerome introduced me to his girlfriend, his professors, and several classmates who had supported him through the ordeal. "Ms. Richardson," he said as we stood outside the auditorium, "I start my new job at a tech company downtown next month. None of this would have been possible if you hadn't stood up for me. Jerome, you would have succeeded no matter what. You're smart, hardworking, and determined. I just made sure you got a fair chance to prove it." "But that's the point, isn't it?" he said. "Everyone deserves a fair chance. What you did wasn't just about me, it was about everyone who comes after me." As for me, Morrison and Associates asked for my resignation the day after the Tribune article ran. I gave it to them gladly, along with a carefully worded letter explaining that I could no longer work for a firm that valued reputation over justice. But endings, I've learned, are really just beginnings in disguise. The ACLU of Illinois reached out to me the following week. They were looking for a staff attorney to head up their criminal justice reform initiative, focusing specifically on judicial accountability and bias in sentencing. The salary was less than what I made at Morrison and Associates, but the work would be everything I had dreamed of when I first decided to become a lawyer. "Maya," said ACLU Legal Director Jennifer Morrison, no relation to my former boss, during my interview, "we need someone who understands the system from the inside, someone who's willing to challenge injustice even when it's uncomfortable. What you did in Judge Bradshaw's courtroom showed us exactly the kind of courage we're looking for." The position came with a staff of 3 attorneys, 2 paralegals, and a budget to investigate judicial misconduct, file civil rights lawsuits, and advocate for systemic reform. It was more responsibility than I'd ever had, and more opportunity to make a real difference. Judge Patricia Williams called me the day I accepted the position. "Maya," she said, and I could hear the pride in her voice, "I want you to know that what you did has changed things. Not just for Judge Bradshaw but for the whole system. There are judges who are going to think twice now before they let their prejudices show in court. There are lawyers who are going to be a little braver because they saw someone speak up and survive." She was right. In the months that followed, I received dozens of calls from attorneys who had witnessed judicial bias but had been afraid to speak up. The Tribune article had given them permission to come forward, and the ACLU was able to document patterns of misconduct that had been hidden for years. We filed successful complaints against 3 other judges, leading to censures and mandatory bias training. We also worked with the Illinois legislature to pass new rules requiring implicit bias training for all judges and creating clearer procedures for reporting judicial misconduct. 6 months after my confrontation with Judge Bradshaw, he was censured by the Judicial Inquiry Board and ordered to attend extensive bias training. It wasn't the removal from the bench that many of us had hoped for, but it was accountability, and accountability was a start. I appeared before him one more time, representing a young Latina woman named Sofia Hernandez who had been charged with shoplifting. Sofia was 19 years old, a single mother trying to support her infant daughter while working part-time at a grocery store. She had taken a package of diapers and baby formula without paying, items she needed for her child but couldn't afford. When I entered Judge Bradshaw's courtroom that day, I felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. The last time I'd stood before his bench, my career had imploded. This time, I was there as a representative of the ACLU, with the full weight of that organization behind me. Judge Bradshaw looked at me with something I'd never seen before, respect, tinged with wariness. He knew I was watching, that the whole legal community was watching, and his conduct was exemplary. He listened carefully to both sides, asked appropriate questions, and showed genuine concern for finding a just resolution. The case was resolved fairly, with Sophia receiving community service and parenting classes rather than jail time. The judge also connected her with social services that could help her find better housing and job training opportunities. As I packed up my files after the hearing, Judge Bradshaw called out to me. "Ms. Richardson, a moment?" I approached the bench, unsure what to expect. The courtroom was empty except for the court personnel, and the afternoon light was streaming through the tall windows. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day. About treating people as individuals rather than stereotypes. About the assumptions I make and the words I use. I don't agree with your methods, but I understand your message." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is where change begins. "Your Honor," I said, "I appreciate you saying that. Sophia Hernandez deserved the consideration you showed her today. Every defendant deserves that level of respect." He nodded slowly. "Yes, they do. I'm still learning that, Ms. Richardson. After 15 years on the bench, I'm still learning." As I write this, it's been exactly 1 year since I stood up in Judge Bradshaw's courtroom and spoke the words that changed my life. I'm now the senior staff attorney for criminal justice reform at the ACLU of Illinois, and every day I fight for the principles that cost me my comfortable corporate job but gave me something infinitely more valuable. The knowledge that I stood up for when it mattered most. I won't lie and tell you it's been easy. There are still lawyers who cross the street when they see me coming, still judges who view me with suspicion, still moments when I wonder if speaking up was worth the price I paid. The legal community has a long memory, and being labeled a troublemaker has consequences that extend far beyond a single case or courtroom. But then I think about Jerome Washington, who sends me a Christmas card every year with a photo of him at his job in the tech industry. In this year's card, he included a picture of himself at his college graduation and another of him receiving an award for excellence in software development. "Ms. Richardson," he wrote, "thank you for seeing me as a person worthy of respect. That changed everything." I think about Sophia Hernandez, who completed her community service and parenting classes and now works as a certified nursing assistant at a local hospital. She was able to find stable housing for herself and her daughter, and last month she sent me a photo of her daughter's first birthday party. I think about the young woman who approached me last month after I spoke at a law school career fair. She told me that my story inspired her to report a discriminatory professor who had been making racist comments in class. The professor was required to attend sensitivity training, and the law school implemented new policies for addressing bias in the classroom. I think about the emails I receive from lawyers across the country who say they found the courage to speak up because they saw someone else do it first. A public defender in Atlanta who challenged a judge's use of racially coded language. A prosecutor in Denver who refused to seek excessive sentences for defendants of color. A legal aid attorney in Detroit who filed a formal complaint about judicial bias instead of staying silent. The ripple effects continue to spread in ways I never could have imagined. The Illinois legislature passed the Judicial Accountability Act, requiring implicit bias training for all judges and creating clear procedures for reporting misconduct. The Chicago Bar Association established a committee on judicial bias, and law schools across the state now include courses on recognizing and addressing discrimination in the legal system. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that justice isn't something that exists in courtrooms and law books. It's something that lives in the courage of individual people who decide that speaking up is more important than staying safe. They thought they could silence me by threatening my career. They thought that fear of professional consequences would keep me in line, would make me complicit in a system that dehumanizes the people I swore to defend. They thought that the prospect of losing my job, my reputation, and my comfortable life would be enough to make me look the other way when injustice happened right in front of me. They were wrong. I discovered that my voice, our voices, are more powerful than any threat, any intimidation, any attempt to make us smaller. I learned that there are moments in life when you have to choose between being liked and being right, between being safe and being brave, between protecting yourself and protecting others. I chose to be right. I chose to be brave. I chose to protect a young man who deserved better from the system that was supposed to serve him. And in doing so, I discovered something that no one can ever take away from me, the knowledge that when it mattered most, I stood up. The law is supposed to be blind to race, to class, to privilege. But justice isn't blind. Justice requires eyes wide open, voices raised high, and hearts brave enough to speak even when the whole system tells you to be quiet. I am Maya Richardson and I refuse to be quiet. Because in a world where silence is complicated, speaking up isn't just a choice, it's a responsibility. It's a responsibility to the Jerome Washingtons of the world, to the Sophia Hernandezes, to my brother Marcus, to my grandmother who cleaned houses for families who barely saw her as human. That responsibility doesn't end when the gavel falls or when the case is closed. It continues every single day, in every courtroom, in every interaction where dignity hangs in the balance and humanity waits to be affirmed. They wanted me to know my place. Instead, I helped create a place where justice could finally breathe, where young people could stand before judges and be seen as individuals rather than stereotypes, where lawyers could advocate zealously without fear of retaliation. The American dream isn't about achieving comfort and then protecting it at all costs. The American dream is about using whatever privilege, education, or platform you have to make things better for the people who come after you. It's about refusing to accept injustice as the price of getting along. Every time I walk into a courtroom now, I carry with me the voices of every person who has been judged not for their actions but for their appearance, every defendant who has been denied dignity, every family that has been broken by a system that sees them as less than human. And I carry with me the knowledge that change is possible, that speaking up matters, that individual courage can create systemic transformation. Because I've seen it happen. I've lived it. They judged me by my willingness to stay silent. I showed them the power of speaking truth.